depression. It's a great high note to end on, right? We're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 19. According to the World Health Organization, America is the saddest place on planet Earth. According to their statistics, by percentage, we have more discouraged and depressed people in America than any other nation in the world. So just to think about that for a second. Think about the country of Lebanon and all the wars and internal strife that is going on there. And we have more depressed people than they do there. Think about Mexico and their vast unemployment. But yet we have, by percentage, more depressed people here than in Mexico. When you think of a place like Nigeria and the utter poverty that people are living in, but yet we are more depressed than the people of Nigeria. Like, we live in a country in which there are plenty of people who are experiencing depression and discouragement in their lives. I remember when I was in seminary, I had a class, and it was a counseling class, and the professor, it was a room full of about 100 people, and he was standing up front. He asked us, he said, is there anyone in this room today who has never experienced depression in your life? And there were about 3 or 4 hands that went up, and mine was one of them. I was 27 years old at the time, and honestly, I could say at 27 years of age, I had never had a time in my life where I felt depressed. And so I put my hand up in the air, and there was a guy sitting next to me who was old. He was like 45 at the time, okay? Which doesn't seem old because that's how old I am now. And he leaned over to me with my hand in the air. He said, the only problem is you haven't lived long enough. Right? And I have learned now that I'm old, like 45 now, and I have learned that if you just live long enough, you are going to just experience discouragement and depression. John Bunyan, a famous author, a Christian author, wrote a great classic called Pilgrim's Progress. And it's a story about a person who comes to faith in Christ, and they're making this journey. Pilgrim is his name, and he's making his journey to the celestial city, which represents heaven. And really, Bunyan talks about how this person and how this believer experiences all these hardships and difficulties in his life. And one of the things that he experiences is called the slough of despair, the pit of despair. The slough of despondency is what he calls it. And it's really just the pit of despair. He calls it's depression and discouragement. And he says the pilgrim falls into this, and he's trying every way he can. He's trying to grab everything he can to pull himself out of this pit. And when I think about that, I think about a lot of times when we experience depression and discouragement in our lives, there's a lot of things that we reach for. There's people in our world, there's people in our culture who are depressed and discouraged, and maybe you've experienced this too. You're in that pit of discouragement, and you reach out for different things. Some people try to reach out for drugs and alcohol. Some people try to reach for relationships. Some people try to reach for entertainment. They try to reach for all these things to pull themselves out of discouragement, but none of them help. And Pilgrim found out he reached for all these things, and he just kept sinking deeper and deeper in the pit of despair. And the only way he was able to get out was when the character Help came and grabbed hold of his hand and pulled him out of the pit of despair. I want to encourage you this morning that if you're facing discouragement or depression, or when it does come in your life, because it will come, don't try to reach out for all these other things that the world says will pull you out. I want you to reach for Jesus, who will give you a hand and pull you out of discouragement and depression. Here in 1 Kings chapter 19, we're going to look at the life of the man Elijah. We kind of met him last week, if you were here, and we were talking about that widow of Zarephath, and she was living in hopelessness, and how God sent the prophet Elijah to her, and he spoke through Elijah to this woman, and how God miraculously provided the flour and the oil, and her son died, and Elijah, through the power of God, brought him back to life. And now Elijah, in his life, after this, he goes to this mountaintop. It still hadn't rained for a long time, and he's challenging these false prophets to the god Baal on the top of this mountain. And he's saying, hey, let's find out whose God is the real God. And they both build an altar, and the prophets of Baal are dancing around, and Elijah's kind of making fun of them. He says, hey, maybe your God's sleeping, or maybe he's on vacation. Maybe you need to cry out louder. Maybe you need to do this. And they do all these things, and nothing happens. And then Elijah builds his altar, and they cover it with water. And Elijah gets down on his knees, and he just simply says a little prayer to God. And then all of a sudden, fire comes from heaven, burns up the altar, cleans up all of the water, and the prophets of Baal start running away, and Elijah and his men start chasing after them, and they put them to death. And now what has happened is word now has got back to the king of the land, and Elijah's life is in danger. And Elijah starts to get discouraged and depressed. What Elijah hasn't learned yet, and it's our headline today, but it's what he is going to learn, is what I want you to learn today, is that when you are down, look up. Like when you are down and you don't know where to turn, look up. Because there is a God who is there. And there's a lot of times, and there's really just three basic times in which we experience discouragement and depression in our lives. Sometimes we get discouraged, sometimes we get depressed because there are things that we don't think should happen, and then they occur. You know, so for instance, so like a really godly young mother has some young children, and she is diagnosed with cancer and dies just several months later. That can bring about discouragement and depression because it's something that we think shouldn't happen, but then it occurs. It causes us to be depressed, discouraged. And the other instances that we experience depression and discouragement are things that we think should happen, and then they don't occur. So you think, man, I should get that promotion at work, or I think I should get that A on the test, or I think that, you know, this circumstance in my life ought to work out this way, but then it doesn't. And we get discouraged and depressed. So when we don't think things should happen and they happen, or when we think things should happen and they don't happen, it causes discouragement. But also, the third way in which sometimes we get discouraged and depressed is when we are waiting for something to happen and it doesn't happen when we think it should. And we have to wait. Sometimes we get discouraged and depressed. And as we've been looking through this series, we've been talking about really when we experience these emotions in our life, when we experience these setbacks in our life, when we experience these hurts in our life, that when we listen to we sometimes listen to the lies that they tell us. And the lie of depression and discouragement is this, is that you can't and God won't. Like when you are experiencing depression and discouragement in your life, you are listening to that lie that tells me I can't and God won't. Like I can't change the circumstance and it gets me depressed, and we believe that God won't change the circumstance and it causes us to be depressed. And people talk about it, they call it the progression of depression. And the progression of depression kind of goes like this. We all experience disappointments in our life. Charles Stanley said one time, he said, disappointments are inevitable, but discouragement is a choice. But all of us are going to face these disappointments in our life, that things are going to happen that we didn't want to happen, or things that we wanted to happen, they don't turn out the way we wanted, and so we're disappointed. And as we listen to this lie of discouragement, when we get disappointed that I can and God won't, then we start to get discouraged. We lose courage. We say, well, I can't face this circumstance any longer, and I don't want to move forward, and I just want to give up, and we become discouraged. And then the final step in that progression of depression is then we enter depression. We are depressed. It's hard for us to even get out of bed in the morning. We just want to give up on everything. Because we listen to this lie that I can't and God won't, and then we start to go through that progression of depression. Now, I do want to say a caveat here as we start this morning, is that all of us are going to face disappointments, all of us are going to be discouraged, all of us are going to be depressed at some point in our lives. But if you're here and you're one who struggles with like what we would consider clinical depression, I want to encourage you to get help. I want you to come and see me or Pastor John, and we have some people that we know that that can help you really to walk through some of that, because sometimes it's not just an emotional issue. Sometimes it's a physiological issue. Sometimes there's a chemical imbalance, and then you need help for that. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like if I broke my arm, I'm not ashamed to go to the doctor because I need my arm fixed. And so I don't know why we've created shame around this whole idea of mental health, that sometimes if there's a physical imbalance, that we ought to seek help for that. There should be no shame in that. So please come and see us. But we're going to talk about just these normal ups and downs in our life when we're disappointed and discouraged. And so we're going to look here in 1 Kings chapter 19, life of Elijah, and really what he experiences and how he begins to listen to this lie that he can't and God won't. I want to share with you the profile of discouragement and depression today. And so really three emotions that Elijah experiences in his life. And the first one is fear. When we listen to this lie of discouragement, we become fearful. When we believe that I can't and God won't, we become fearful. Listen to what it says, beginning in chapter 19, verse 1. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Now Ahab here is your typical weak-willed husband, right? He sees what happens, and the first thing that he does is he goes and tells his wife, hey, honey, you won't believe what Elijah did, and so I need you to do something about it, okay? And so he comes and tells his wife about what he had done. So Jezebel, the typical domineering wife, says, so Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them. And so Jezebel sends a message to Elijah, and she says, listen, your days are numbered. You got one, okay? Because by this time tomorrow, if you are not dead, I am praying that the gods deal with me severely because I want you dead. And listen to what happens to Elijah in the very next sentence. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. Like Elijah started to believe the lie that I can't and God won't. I can't protect myself and God won't protect me. And think about this. He just not long ago, he was on top of a mountain and God demonstrated his power in a miraculous way and burned up that entire altar. And now here he is in discouragement and depression, and he's believing the lie that I can and God won't. And now he's afraid. And when we listen to this lie of discouragement, we start to begin to ask the question, what if? Right? Like I studied so hard for this test and I failed. What if I don't pass the class? Like the doctor has given me a diagnosis that I wasn't expecting, and now I'm discouraged and I'm listening to the lie that I can and God won't. What if I never get better? I lost my job and I don't know how I'm going to make ends meet. And what if I never find a job again? We start to ask all of those what ifs because we believe this lie that I can't and God won't, and we begin to ask the what ifs, and our mind starts to spiral out of control, and we become fearful because I can't and God won't. Now, Elijah was a man, we read this, and we're reading it, 6,000, 7,000 years later, and we read this, and we're like, well, yeah, but doesn't he remember what God just had done in his life? Listen, you and I are no different than Elijah. Because not only do we ask the what ifs, but we also make the yeah buts. Okay? You know what the yeah buts are? People will say to us, hey, why are you depressed? Don't you remember how God took care of you in this situation? Yeah, but it's different today. We get the yeah buts. Okay? Well, what about the time in which, yeah, you did maybe lose your job? Remember that time you were unemployed and still God provided for everything that you need? Yeah, but this is different. And Elijah starts to use the yeah buts in his life. And he said, not only what if, but now I'm afraid because, yeah, I know God did that, but Jezebel wasn't trying to kill me then. Yeah, God did that. Yeah, but all these false prophets that I killed, all their buddies are probably going to come after me too. And we get the yeah buts. The what ifs and the yeah buts, and we become afraid because we have listened to the lie that I can't and God won't. And when you are beginning to use the what ifs and the yeah buts, I want to encourage you, when you are down, to look up. So he was fearful. The next emotion that we experience when we are depressed and discouraged is isolation. Listen to what happens. So in verse 3, Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there. While he himself went a day's journey into the desert, he came to a broom tree, sat down under it, and prayed. Okay, now we read this, and I know we live in America, so we're not really a lot of times familiar with the geography in Judah. But Beersheba was as far south in the country as you could possibly go. You couldn't go any further south than Beersheba. So Elijah and his servant, they go all the way to Beersheba. He says, I'm just going to run away. I'm afraid. And I'm going to run away from everybody. And he gets to Beersheba. And you know what? He tells the servant, all right, you wait here in Beersheba. And he still goes another day's journey south. He deserts to the desert. He isolates himself. When we experience discouragement and depression in our lives, we believe this lie that I can't and God won't, and we begin then to isolate ourselves from everyone around us. Right? That's when we begin to close the shades in our house and lock the door. We take the phone off. Well, we don't do that anymore because we all have cell phones, but we don't take the phone off the hook, but we put our phone on silence now because we don't want to talk to anybody. We never go out of the house. We don't get involved in other people's lives because we're discouraged and we're depressed and we believe this lie that I can't and God won't, and we then isolate ourselves from everyone else in our life. The very thing that causes us to spiral deeper and deeper into discouragement and depression. And this is what Elijah does. He runs and he gets as far away from everybody as he can. And then he leaves the one person who was walking with him. He goes all the way, another day's journey to get away. And you and I need connections in our life, especially when we're experiencing discouragement and depression in our lives. The one thing that we need the most is the one thing that we isolate ourselves from the most, and that is relationships. Relationships are important. There was a French study done several years ago, and they did a study on 17,000 utility workers in France. And they discovered that the number of social interactions that these utility workers had, it was correlated to how many would still be alive 10 years later. They did a study here in America with 3,000 young people. And they saw a correlation that the people that had more intimate friendships were less likely to die young. Like, I know that correlation is not causation all the time, but there is something there. Like, God has created us to be social beings with one another. And the worst thing that we can do is isolate ourselves from other people, especially when we need them the most. So we become fearful. We begin to isolate ourselves, but God is saying, hey, when you are down, I want you to look up. When you're down, when you can't make sense of anything that's going on, I want you to look up. And the third thing that we see here in Elijah's life that oftentimes we do, we're fearful, we isolate ourselves, and then we get to the point of surrender. So he's gone to Beersheba. He goes another day's journey after that, and he sat down, he came to a broom tree, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the tree and fell asleep. He got to the point in which he said, I don't even want to live any longer. He begins to wave the white flag of surrender. He says, God, just kill me. Now, on a side note here, he says, because I'm no better than my ancestors. Listen, don't ever get into the comparison trap, because it will lead you to be discouraged. Like, God made you to be you. I don't think God ever asked Elijah to be his ancestors. God has never asked you to live up to some standard that maybe you or somebody else in your life has placed on you. Like, you be you. My kids are loving to say the phrase, you do you. I don't even know what that means, but that's what they say all the time. So I'm going to say it because I want to be hip and cool. So you do you, okay? You be you. Don't be anybody else, and because it'll lead to that. And so here he is, and he's just waving the white flag of surrender. He's isolated himself from everybody else. He says, God, I can't, and you won't, and so I am just done. I'm checking out. I'm just working out the terms of the surrender here, and just kill me now, because I don't want to go on any longer. Because it's just too hard. We just begin to give up. Because we believe the lie that we can't and God won't. There's a woman by the name of Christina. She prayed for her father to come to faith in Jesus. She wanted her father to become a Jesus follower. And she said, one of the first times I mentioned Jesus to my father when I was an adult, he looked at me and said, well, if God sends people to hell, I don't want to spend time in heaven with that kind of a God. And she said she just started praying. Starting that day, she prayed every single day for her father. She said she thought maybe there was a breakthrough when her brother suddenly died at 47 years of age. But at the funeral, her father stood up and said, there's no life after this life. There's no life after death. There's just life and the grave. And Christina said she prayed and prayed and prayed for 29 years. She prayed every single day for 29 years for her father to come to faith in Jesus. And then she said one day after 29 years, she was just having a normal conversation with her father, and he asked, tell me about that Jesus thing again. She shared her faith with her father, and on that day, he prayed, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And became a follower of Jesus Christ. Christine says 2 weeks later, her father died of a sudden heart attack. Christina says this after the fact. She said, there were so many times over those 29 years that I believed that God would not save my father. And there were times even when I was praying that I thought, well, this is just worthless. Why am I praying? She said, I thought about many times about just giving up, that it was no use of continuing on. And then she said, but today I am eternally thankful that I did not give up. Like, it's so easy when we're discouraged to believe the lie that I can't and God won't, and then just simply to give up. But God is saying, when you are down, I want you to look up. Because what Elijah learns here, and what I want you to learn, is the reason why we can look up, because this is the truth of discouragement. The truth of discouragement tells us this, is that God can. God can. Whatever the circumstance in your life, whatever the situation that you find yourself in, no matter how much it's disappointed you, no matter how discouraged or disappointed or depressed or disillusioned you are with the circumstances of your life, God can. God can change the circumstances. Absolutely, He can change the circumstances. But sometimes, maybe even more importantly, God may not change the circumstances, but He can change you in the midst of your circumstances. That's why James tells us that we ought to rejoice in our trials and tribulations, knowing that it produces in us perseverance and character. And then he says character doesn't disappoint, because ultimately it produces within us hope. And he says hope never disappoints. Because God can. He can change the circumstances. He can change you in the midst of the circumstances. So when you are down, look up. And that's what Elijah is going to learn here in his life, that when he was down, that he could look up and God could do great and mighty things. And so I just want to conclude the last several minutes here talking about how we begin to look up. How do we get over this hurdle of disappointments and discouragements and depression in our lives? Listen to what happens in the next thing. So he prays that God would kill him. He lies down under the tree and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there by his head was a cake of bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights. That was like an energy bar right there. Okay? Until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. Now listen, sometimes I heard Chuck Swindoll say one time, he said, sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is take a nap. Okay? To recharge and to re-energize. Instead of trying to continue to go on and try to push through whatever it is that you're going through, that sometimes, now listen, I'm not trying to make an excuse for you to be lazy, but sometimes you just need to rest. Okay? And so here God provides Elijah everything that he needs. God's going to provide everything that you need. Whatever you're facing today, God can. He can provide for you whatever you need. So he travels 40 days, 40 nights, and now he's in a cave. Emotionally, nothing has changed. The only thing that's changed in Elijah's life is he's no longer in the desert, now he's in a cave. And then here's what happens. When he is down, he looks up. And really how we apply this to our lives. Number one is this, is draw near and hear. Draw near and hear. Draw near to God and hear what he has to say. So here he is in the cave where he spent the night. And the word of the Lord came to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? Now, I don't think that God is saying this in a condemning fashion. Like, I don't think God could have said, yeah, I can't believe what you're doing. Don't you remember what I did for you? But God's not like that. I think God is saying this in a very compassionate tone. He says, Elijah, buddy, what are you doing here? He replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, broken down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left now, and now they are trying to kill me too. I can't, and you won't. The Lord said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, and the Lord was not in the wind. In the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a what? Gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Draw near and hear. God did not speak to him through the earthquake. He didn't speak to him through the whirlwind. He didn't speak to him through the fire. He spoke to him in a gentle whisper. When you are depressed and discouraged, when you're down, look up and draw near and hear. Draw near to God. James chapter 4 verse 8 tells us this, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Draw near to God in prayer. Speak to him in prayer. God is okay, right? Elijah says, God, listen to what's going on here. They tore down your altars. They've not listened to anything that I've said. They have rejected me. They've put all of my friends to death, and now they're even killing me. God is big enough to listen to your disappointments and discouragements and the reasons why you're depressed. He wants you to pray those things out to him. Draw near to him and speak to him in prayer. Be honest with him. And also listen to God through his word. Allow it to counsel your decisions. Allow it to captivate your heart. Read his word and find out what he has to say to you. Like Elijah may not have heard that gentle whisper had he not walked out of the cave. You got to draw near and hear and speak to God in prayer and listen to him in his word. It's important for you to be in church like this so that you can hear God's word explained. Hopefully it's encouraging to you. You got to spend some time on your own and just thumbing through the pages of the Bible and find out what God is speaking to you, because I know this, that in times of my discouragement and disappointments and disillusionments and depression, God has spoke to me so powerfully through the pages of his word. He has encouraged me, has lifted me up even when I was lower than a snail's belly. When you are down, look up, draw near and hear, but also then, number 2, is connect with other believers. Connect with other believers. So Elijah hears this voice of God. Then the voice said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? He replied again, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, broken down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. The Lord said to him, go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. Like, hey, God, I just walked 40 days and 40 nights here. Now you want me to go back? Also, listen to what he says. When you get there, anoint Hazael, king of Aram. Also anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel, Maloah, to succeed you as prophet. Jehu will put to death any who escape the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death any who escape the sword of Jehu. Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and all whose mouths have not kissed him. You know what God is saying to Elijah here? He says, Elijah, I want you to go back because there's people who got your back. Like, I want you to anoint this person, and this person. And you know what? They're going to take up swords, and they got your back. They're going to fight for you. And by the way, you thought you were all alone? There's still 7,000 people there who have not bowed their knee. They're still with you. They're still in your corner. And what he's telling Elijah, he says, I want you to get out of this cave, get out of this funk, get out of your isolation and your fear and your discouragement, and I want you to get out there, and I want you to start connecting with other people who can encourage you. Even when you are depressed and discouraged and disappointed and disillusioned, you know what God is saying to you today? Connect with other believers. You got to be with others who can encourage you when life is down. Not James, but in 1 Peter 5:8, Peter tells us this. He said, we have an enemy who's like a prowling lion seeking someone to devour. I don't know if I love those nature shows like Jack Hanna and all that. I love those. And if you ever watch the nature show, what does the lion, the cheetah, the tiger, what do they always do? They're going to capture their prey. What do? They isolate it from the rest of the herd. They find the one that's hurt, the one that's lame, the one that's sick, and then they isolate it because then it's most vulnerable. And Peter is telling us, hey, our enemy is the same way. He's like a lion. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to isolate you from the rest of the people so that he can devour you. God says, don't let that happen. Connect with other people, because in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25, he said, don't forsake yourselves assembling together, as is the habit of some. But connect, draw near to one another, and encourage one another, all the more as you see the day drawing near. He says, as you see the end of the world coming, he said the thing that we ought to do more is be together more, not isolate ourselves more. When you see the end of your world coming and you're like, I don't know if I can get out of bed tomorrow. I don't know if I want to continue on. Maybe you're to the point in which you're saying, like Elijah, and saying, God, just end all this right now. When you're at the end of your world, he says that's when the most you need one another to encourage one another. All the more as you see the day drawing near. Draw near and here and connect with other believers so that when you are down, you can look up because God can. When you can't, he can. We have been having some testimonies through this. There's a video here that I want to share with you of a testimony of a pastor who experienced great discouragement and depression in his life. I want you to understand that if you go through this, you may say, well, maybe I'm not spiritual enough. That's not the case. Like, all of us are prone to discouragement and disappointments and depression in our lives. So let's listen to his story.